My name is Vimala Pangsman. I'm the organizing director at the Caucus Action Fund. Welcome to Priorities for Progress 2021. Movement organizations propose bold solutions for a nation in crisis. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to direct your attention to the chat where we'll be sending out more information about the Progressive Governance Project. We are facing interlocking public health, economic, racial justice, and climate crises on an unprecedented scale. At the same time, the first progressive governing moment in a decade offers us an opportunity to deliver real results for the American people. The work ahead of us is formidable, and we can't afford to fail. Last year, we convened the Progressive Governance Project, a gathering of over 70 organizations from across the progressive movement, including grassroots organizations, labor unions, and policy think tanks. This was not a theoretical exercise in policymaking, but a project driven by the urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic devastation for so many, a rise in violent white supremacy, and movement demands for racial justice. The specter of an existential climate crisis, guided by desires to deliver relief swiftly, create structural change, and advance equity and racial justice, the Progressive Governance Project developed 8 policy agendas highlighting top legislative and administrative priorities on climate, democracy, economic justice, foreign policy, healthcare, immigration, reproductive rights, health and justice, and worker power. Today, we'll hear from representatives from each of the 8 working groups on their views on how the 117th Congress and the Biden administration should address this moment of crisis unlike any other. But first, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Congressman Chuy Garcia, representative of Illinois' 4th Congressional District. He currently serves as a member of the influential Financial Services Committee, Natural Resources Committee, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Representative Garcia is the Vice Chair at Large of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Equality Caucus, Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus, and New American Caucus. He's a busy congressman. He is also the founder of the Future of Transportation Caucus. Congressman Garcia, thanks for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, friends. My name is Chuy Garcia, and I represent the 4th District of Illinois. I'm proud to join you today to kick off this week of the Progressive Governance Project. If you're like me, you're feeling a lot more optimistic than you were 6 months ago. With the new administration and new Senate, we can actually accomplish some things that we've been working on together for years. But as you know, that just means we've got to work harder. You're going to hear from some great movement partners today, but I wanted to take a moment to discuss some of the things that I hope to accomplish in this Congress. I'll start with immigration. I'm an immigrant myself. I represent a heavily Latino immigrant district. For my community, this is personal and it's urgent. After 4 years of fear and persecution, we need to get back to our roots as a country that welcomes and embraces immigrants. The CPC's Progressive Roadmap calls for an immigration system centered on family reunification, humane alternatives to detention and deportation, a pathway to citizenship for millions living in fear, and protections for those fleeing violence and hunger. And I'm excited to work with my colleagues in the Progressive Caucus and with you all to make it a reality. I also want to highlight my work on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The new infrastructure package that we'll be putting together soon will be a major stimulus package and, to use President Biden's phrase, a down payment on the Green New Deal. The next infrastructure bill must build sustainable transportation networks, guarantee equitable access to jobs and services, and sustain vibrant neighborhoods instead of carving up Black and Latino neighborhoods or fueling gentrification. And it's got to pass into law. And finally, we have got to build an equitable economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. That means protecting renters and keeping them in their homes. It means taking on hedge funds and private equity firms that destroy jobs. It means raising the minimum wage, and it means passing the PRO Act and strengthening the right to organize. We've got a lot of work to do, but I believe that together we'll get it done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman Garcia, for the inspiring words, and we appreciate all the work that you and your team are doing in Congress. Our first speaker today is Isaiah Wilson, the Senior Legislative Program Manager at SEIU. Isaiah is representing the Democracy Work Group. The Democracy Work Group includes Color Change, Common Cause, DEMOS, and Citizens United Action Fund, Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Public Citizen, and SEIU. Isaiah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vimala, and the Progressive Caucus Action Fund for convening this space and advancing this work. Again, my name is Isaiah Wilson representing the 2 million working people of the Service Employees International Union who continue at this hour to serve on the front lines of the pandemic and keeping our way of life functioning. I want to also recognize all of my working group colleagues who have contributed to the democracy portion of this progressive governance project. Now, before we move into the recommendations, it's imperative that we frame this conversation in the present moment we find ourselves. Because when we wrote the recommendations last summer into the fall, we could not imagine the events of 1/6. The reckoning that our democracy continues to face in the aftermath of the 2020 election and the insurrection of our capital is a pattern in American history. Every time we have made progress, especially when it comes to the advancement of Black political power, we have seen a backlash that time after time leads to trauma, violence, and terror targeted at Black folks and other marginalized communities. Take Wilmington, North Carolina, and the insurrection of 1898, New York City and the race riots of 1900, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the massacre of Black Wall Street in 1921. We have seen this before. In recent times, they haven't been as negative, but they should have shown us with the rise of the Tea Party and Donald Trump and birtherism after the election of Barack Obama in 2008. There is an issue that we need to address, that our democracy is fragile, that our democracy needs strength. And 2020 is no different. With the record turnout during a pandemic from communities of color and young people, this coalition of voters elevated the first woman of Black and Indian ancestry to the second highest office of the land. And Black and brown voters not only made the difference in battleground states that elected President Biden and Vice President Harris, but they also in Georgia elected the first Black and Jewish senators, shifting the balance of power in the Senate. This all combined with the fact that we have had an active conspiracy led by the 45th president to call into question the integrity of our election system in order to hold on to his grasp of power. And now we have so many anti-democratic state legislators in 33 states advancing 165 bills to restrict voting access, according to the Brennan Center so far this year. These events, especially 1/6, are not surprising. Embarrassing, horrific, terrifying, yes, but surprising. No, because our beautiful yet troubled country was founded with the original sin of slavery and the perpetuation of white supremacy, racism, sexism, anti-Blackness. It's embedded in our laws and society. Let's be clear. American democracy was designed to enshrine the power of white men at the expense of all others, and particularly to keep Black and brown people from building governing power through the political system. But the resistance to these circumstances led by Black people and others who joined to take on this pervasive injustice is what inspires me today. The record amount of organizing, activism, voting, and overall participation in our democracy last cycle in the middle of a pandemic is what gives me hope. We just need Congress to urgently pass into law key reforms and the Biden administration to implement them without delay. And with that, I'll move on to our next slide, which shows our legislative actions that we are advising that the 117th Congress prioritize. For the first 100 days, we said for 4 bills that really we believe should be prioritized. The first of them being HR 1, the For the People Act, which, as you know, would be the transformational anti-corruption and election reforms package. I want to particularly highlight the additions in the new version of this bill that are advancing voting, sustaining many of the voting reforms that were passed at the state level last year, including requiring that all states be required to implement online voter registration, automatic voter registration, and same-day registration, which was a critical factor in turnout last year. Registration has long been weaponized by those empowered to prevent communities of color from voting, and we have to pass HR 1 without delay to advance those priorities for our democracy. We also want to advance the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. With the continued push of certain state legislators to pass anti-democratic laws that restrict the vote in states, it's exactly why we need to reauthorize the VRA and make sure that we restore it to its prominence, that it actually has been gutted since the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2013. We also want to once and for all give 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia the right to vote, the right for representation in their Congress by passing the Washington, D.C. Admission Act. We also want to lift up former Congressman, now Senator Lujan's Native American Voting Rights Act, or NAVRA. This is important to really build and invest in the democracy within our tribal indigenous communities and to restore those voting protections that are essential to ensure that we actually live out multiracial democracy. Finally, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, it was introduced after our working group completed writing our portion, but we want to also make sure to highlight the importance of holding accountable the executive branch and making sure that checks and balances once and for all keeps our democracy moving and advancing and representing the people as it was founded to be. We also reference in the report a series of congressional ethics and judicial ethics reforms. Foreign interference in election security are also tackled. And finally, we lift up racial injustice and the need to root out what the issue is when it comes to racial injustice in our country, and lifting up HR 40, which we are excited today is getting finally a hearing in the Congress. And that's the Exploring the Path for Reparative Justice, which is going to be sponsored by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Finally, when it comes to the executive branch, we're excited that the Biden administration has already moved on our ethics EO recommendation on day 1 that was signed. And then we also has committed to publicly releasing visitor log hours. We also want to highlight some other executive actions around directing federal agencies like the Department of Justice to reinvigorate our voting rights statutes, which have been depleted over the last 4 years. We also want to direct agencies like the Social Security Administration to offer voter registration opportunities to their clients. One final point that I want to raise in our recommendation for the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House is to publish all unclassified opinions so that transparency in the White House is the rule and not the exception. In conclusion, these recommendations answer the call of the people who are troubled in the wake of 1/6. Democracy is non-existent without transparency and accountability. We must not shine the light just on the 45th president in the wake of the big lie that he continues to perpetuate, but we must hold accountable all those elected officials and all those in power who would use the big lie to harm our democracy by denying the vote. This cannot stand if we are to survive as a democracy, and the time is now to move on these reforms without delay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isaiah, and the Democracy Working Group for working to reverse disenfranchisement and the dominance of big money in politics, safeguard our elections, and boost the civic power of communities of color. The next speaker we have today is Sarah Anderson, the director of the Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Sarah is representing the Economic Justice Working Group. The Economic Justice Working Group includes Institute for Policy Studies, Americans for Financial Reform, National Domestic Workers Alliance, Action Center on Race and the Economy, the Communications Workers of America, National Consumer Law Center, and the National Fair Housing Alliance. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Vimala, and also thanks to Congressman Garcia for starting us off and reminding us of what an incredible political moment we're living in right now. I'm just as excited as he is. And I'm very honored to represent the Economic Justice Working Group of the Progressive Governance Project, which prepared a very detailed set of recommendations. I hope you'll read all 20 pages of them. And if you do, you'll see that quite a number of them are in the COVID relief package working its way through Congress right now. These include, for example, the $15 minimum wage and the expanded tax credits that will significantly reduce poverty. We're also encouraged to see the addition of $10 billion for struggling homeowners and the $350 billion for state and local governments that's going to be so critical to preventing mass layoffs of teachers and other vital public employees. And I have to say, we've been cheering the pushback against critics who are saying that this deal is too big. And it's really exciting to see that pushback coming, not just from members of the Progressive Caucus like Representative Garcia, but also from economic advisors to President Biden. And we'll be working to make sure that Democratic leaders hang tough on this $1.9 trillion plan. With 10 million more unemployed and with racial and economic inequality is so much more severe than even before the pandemic, now is absolutely the time to go big. All of this positive stuff said, many of our working group's recommendations are not in this $1.9 trillion package. In some cases, that's because of the arcane Senate rules that won't allow them in a budget reconciliation deal, which is the only way to get something passed with a straight majority. If a bill doesn't have a significant budgetary impact, you need at least 60 votes. And so this perverse rule means, for example, that all of our recommendations related to economic rights are not in there because they don't cost very much for taxpayers. I'm talking, for example, about proposals for expanded rights for essential workers on the COVID front lines, for domestic workers who've been excluded from many federal labor protections, for bank workers who need to be able to speak freely about financial wrongdoing, and for consumers who are vulnerable to financial predators. These rights-based reforms may not have a big impact on the federal budget, but they're invaluable to millions of people, and so we'll be continuing to push for them. Another reason many of our recommendations are not in this current COVID deal is because it's focused on COVID relief, whereas a recovery bill will be developed later this year. And that will be a huge opportunity to transform our economy in ways that advance economic justice. We'd like to see all of our tax proposals in that bill, including new taxes on wealth, on Wall Street trades, and in corporations with extreme gaps between their CEO and their worker pay. These kinds of taxes are all twofers. We'd raise a bunch of money for good things, and we'd reduce the inequality that's been so damaging to our democracy and our economy. Representative Garcia spoke about the need for massive public investment in transportation and other green economy initiatives. We also want to see in this recovery deal massive public investment to ensure that seniors and others who need care and their caregivers can live in dignity. Finally, some of our recommendations are not in the COVID deal because we don't need Congress to get them done. We need the Biden administration to take action. And so here we're talking about things like canceling federal student debt, vigorously enforcing fair housing regulations to combat racial segregation and discrimination, directing the Federal Reserve to offer ongoing zero interest loans to all state and local governments, putting people on the Postal Service board, our poor Postal Service that's so embattled. We need to undo the disastrous slowdown in deliveries and support much needed new postal services, including postal banking. And finally, I'll just say that with any money going to big corporations in the form of federal contracts or aid or tax subsidies, we want that money conditioned on these companies creating good jobs, building worker power, narrowing their gaps, pay gaps, and advancing gender, race, and environmental justice. The Biden administration has shown a willingness to use executive authority for progressive change, but we know as social movements, we're going to need to keep pushing the administration and Congress to use all of the tools in the toolbox to end this crisis and create a more equitable nation that is much stronger in the face of any future crises. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and the Economic Work Group for advocating for immediate relief for workers and families, states and cities, and small businesses to get us to a vaccine, and working to reverse some of the worst economic impacts of the pandemic and to ensure that we are on firmer footing going forward. The next speaker we have up today is Judy Conte, the Government Affairs Director at the National Employment Law Project. Judy is representing the Worker Power Group. The Worker Power Group includes the American Economic Liberties Project, Center for Disability Rights, Center for Law and Social Policy, Economic Policy Institute, Groundwork Collaborative, Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, National Employment Law Project, National Partnership for Women and Families, National Women's Law Center, Policy Link, Public Citizen, and Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Judy, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. The full text of our recommendations is going to be in the materials that I know Vamala is going to be sending out afterwards. So I'm just going to hit some top lines here. I don't have time to mention everything we want to do because, like all of you, we want to do so much, right? We've not only got to make up for the last 4 years, but we really need to build beyond that, build back better, I might say, to coin a phrase. So the overarching themes and goals of our working group are that we need to promote worker power and human dignity, and we need to curb and check corporate power and privatization. We want to build back beyond a failed status quo that was leaving too many people behind. And we want to unrig the rules that are making it harder for workers to make ends meet, to build the kind of power that they deserve, and to have the kind of working conditions that they deserve. All of our work should be focused on Black, Brown, Indigent, immigrant, LGBTQ women workers, and workers with disabilities. Those who are the ones struggling the most in our workforce, because if we lift up their concerns, then we will make the most progress for everybody. So on the legislative front, some of our top line recommendations are, of course, immediate COVID relief, which we all know is progressing. We've got a particular focus on minimum wage and hoping that the parliamentarian will rule in our favor on that, and making sure there's a robust network of programs for unemployed workers, as well as making sure there's ample state, local, and tribal aid so that we don't cut vital services and so that we won't have to lay off more workers across the country as well. And many of the other priorities top tier priorities we have are absolutely relevant as COVID relief as well. Mandatory paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave. We want to see the PRO Act and the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act pass to strengthen union density and worker power in this country. The Paycheck Fairness Act to make sure that we get at the gender wage gap. The Equality Act to make sure that all civil rights in this country are fully extended to all LGBTQ people. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act and the FAIR Act, which would ban mandatory arbitration agreements as a condition of employment. And we want to make sure that there's special attention paid to reforming laws governing mergers, making sure that there's stricter scrutiny review over them, with an eye towards impacts on the labor market, not just the bottom line of corporations. In terms of the administration, I'm thrilled to say that in the first days of the administration and the first weeks, they've already, the president and his team have already gotten to work on so many important priorities, including repealing executive orders that banned effective diversity, equity, and inclusion training for federal employees and federal contractors, working to undo regulations that under the guise of religious freedom would give contractors the ability to discriminate against women and LGBTQ people. The administration has also issued, President Biden has issued an executive order getting agencies ready to raise the federal minimum wage for contractors to $15 per hour. OSHA has issued new and much stronger guidance about health and safety for workers in the COVID era, and is getting ready to drop an emergency temporary standard that will include mandates. We need the administration to do better than the Trump administration did on overtime. We really need to strengthen overtime rules to make sure that workers are adequately paid for all the hours they put in. And we need to undo certain regulations around defining who's an independent contractor and who's a joint employer to make sure that people who are employees are treated as employees, and that employers who play that role are treated as employers in terms of liability. We're going to hear more about immigration reform, but obviously there are very significant parts of the immigration reform bucket that deal with the workforce very specifically, and we look forward to helping to usher in real full-scale just immigration reform in this country. And some of the other issues that we know that the administration is going to have to deal with are gig workers and how they are shut out of so many rights that they should be entitled to, and the way that happens in such a racially disparate fashion, shall we say. It really is systemic racism at work. Dealing with algorithmic employment discrimination and surveillance of workers. We need to reinvent our trade policy and center it on protecting workers' rights, both here and abroad. And the final thing we've recommended is that, we really want the White House and the administration at all levels, when they put together advisory boards, to make sure that it's not just, quite frankly, advocates like all of us, but it is comprised of directly impacted people. The worker activists and leaders throughout this country who are leading the charge and are the most directly impacted by what's going on. They are the ones closest to the problems. They are the ones closest to the solutions. And rather than us bringing their voices to DC, we instead want to really work to make room for them at the table so their voices are heard directly. And with that, I will turn it back over to Vamala. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Judy, and the Worker Power work group for advocating for this administration to commit to breaking up concentrated political and economic power at the top and ensuring that this administration builds worker power, strengthening the right to organize and collectively bargain, and ensure that workers have a say in the workplace and a seat at the table where decisions are made. The next speaker we have today is Amirah Sequeira, who is the lead legislative advocate at National Nurses United, representing the Healthcare Work Group. The following organizations helped to prepare the Healthcare Memorandum: Families USA, Center for Popular Democracy, National Partnership for Women and Families, Public Citizen, and All Means All. Amirah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Vamala. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you today at this briefing. As Vamala said, my name is Amirah. I lead the federal legislative work for National Nurses United. We are the largest union of registered nurses in the country. We represent over 170,000 RNs who are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic response and have been for a year. As a continuation on what Judy was saying, they have been on the front lines of this pandemic without the worker protections they need for a year. So we were really pleased to take part in the working table focused on healthcare recommendations for the Progressive Governance Project. A big thank you to Vamala and the Progressive Caucus Action Fund for pulling this together. And I'd just like to shout out the organizations and partners that we worked it with, who Vamala mentioned on this document. We are in a really critical moment right now regarding healthcare in our country. Many of you watching this, many progressives, we have known for a very long time that the healthcare system in our country fails to provide quality healthcare to a large number of people, right? Many of us have been advocating for a single payer Medicare for all system for many years. But this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has exposed and exacerbated the flaws in our healthcare system on a scale that we have not seen before. Our health system has failed to contain this pandemic, full stop. It has failed to care for patients. It has failed to reduce the spread of the virus. It has failed to protect healthcare workers and their health and safety. And as a result, more than 480,000 people have died. If we had a healthcare system that prioritized patient care instead of corporate profits, a good number of the people we have lost in this pandemic would be alive today. Before this pandemic started, there were at least 30 million Americans who were uninsured. Another minimum 42 million Americans were underinsured, so they had insurance, but they couldn't afford their care. Today, at least an additional 8 million workers have lost their jobs and therefore lost their employer-sponsored health insurance, leaving them and their 7 million plus dependents without the healthcare insurance they had before this pandemic started, while we are living through a global pandemic where people need healthcare. This pandemic has showed us that the link between employment and healthcare, more than anything has showed us before, that we need to break that link between employment and healthcare. Everyone should have healthcare regardless of their employment status. As such, the North Star of our health policy document is winning a Medicare for all guaranteed healthcare system. It is critical that progressives must continue to champion Medicare for all as the best and only full solution to achieving guaranteed healthcare in our country. That said, as we work towards winning Medicare for all, we need to ensure that the single payer system we eventually win, that when we win it, it not only guarantees health coverage to everyone, but it guarantees easily accessible and high quality care, and that it addresses the health disparities we see in our system today and advances health equity. So while progressives are working to win Medicare for all, continuing to build the movement for Medicare for all, there are legislative and administrative priorities. There are steps we can take on the path to achieving Medicare for all. I'm going to outline just a few of them. Please, I encourage you to read our document, which is much more detailed than what I'll go through today, but a few top priorities. First of all, on the road to achieving Medicare for all, both legislatively, and we would need administrative support for this as well, we should be working now to expand Medicare to cover adults over age 50, and to expand Medicare to children with a transition that combines Medicare payment rates with Medicaid combinations of expert providers and longstanding coverage, the full range of services that children need. We should be working on any ACA legislation that we're passing currently. We should be working to make sure that any ACA improvements addresses the needs of underserved and historically marginalized populations. In addition to expanding Medicare, we should be working to strengthen it. Right now, Medicare does not cover dental and vision and hearing and long-term care. We should cover those things in the coming congressional session, and we should limit cost sharing under Medicare. In addition to expanding Medicare, expanding healthcare coverage, we need to be working to bring profit under control and to reduce the massive fraud, waste, and abuse that we see in our system. Right now, HHS could begin to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies for fair drug prices. We should be looking at alternate ways of funding research and development of pharmaceutical products that does not rely on monopolies and high drug prices. We should be working to stop price spikes. And importantly, we need to roll back privatization of the Veterans Affairs Administration. And specifically, given what we've seen during COVID, we need to be working to improve the national medical supply chain. It's very exciting that President Biden has taken important next steps to begin to improve our national medical supply chain. That needs to continue. And lastly, this document that we've prepared has a real focus on achieving health equity. Achieving health equity will require policy change on multiple fronts, including access to equitable care that is free from bias and discrimination, improving cultural competence and language access, and building a transparent and representative evidence base that prioritizes the needs of communities of color. To do this, Congress needs to ensure that all health policy proposals identify and target interventions to eliminate health inequities. We don't need a one-size-fits-all policy proposal that does not address systemic and racist barriers. We need to make sure that any healthcare policy is addressing the systemic and racist barriers that we see. So I encourage you to please take a look at the document for a more detailed list of legislative items and administrative items that Congress and the White House can be taking. Thank you.
Thanks, Amirah and the Healthcare Working Group for advocating to provide people with the healthcare they need, especially during this pandemic, and especially for those most affected by systemic inequalities. The next speaker we have today is Michelle Batchelor from the Interim Vice President of Government Affairs at In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Michelle is representing the Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice Work Group. The Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice Memorandum was heavily informed by the Blueprint for Sexual and Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice, a proactive policy agenda to advance sexual and reproductive health in the United States and around the world, signed by more than 90 organizations. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mala. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. As Mala mentioned, I'm Michelle Batchelor, and I am with In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. We are a national and regional reproductive justice organization, which means that we look at reproductive health and rights through a lens that centers human rights and social justice. And so access to culturally responsive, comprehensive reproductive health care is paramount to all people having bodily autonomy to make the best choices for themselves and their families. It is important and intrinsically connected to a lot of the things that we're talking about today, including access to safe housing, livable wage and economic security, protections from environmental toxins, freedom from abuse, and freedom from over-policing and harassment. It is with this frame that, as Mala mentioned, over 90 reproductive health rights and justice organizations came together to clearly and succinctly lay out our priorities for Congress and the Biden-Harris administration that will not only address harms that have been done by the previous administration, but those that have been done over decades. But in addition to rescinding, we need to move the needle forward so that all people, regardless of their race, ethnicity, immigration status, ability, sexual orientation, sexuality, or zip code, can exercise the bodily autonomy and achieve improved health, economic security, and a brighter, more equitable future. So the priorities that are included in the document that you all have access to now are heavily informed by this blueprint for sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. But at the baseline for equitable and sexual reproductive health, including abortion, are policies that center anti-racism and social justice to ensure high quality, evidence-based sexual and reproductive health care that is accessible to all people, eliminate discriminatory barriers and practices in healthcare that ensure that research, innovation, advance sexual and reproductive health rights and justice now as well as in the future, and that ensure health, rights, justice, and wellness for all communities with a particular focus on that have historically pushed people to the margin. And finally, to support and prioritize the reproductive justice framework that includes the human right to have a child, the right to not have a child, the right to parent the child or children that we have in a safe environment, and the right to bodily autonomy. So in many parts of the United States and around the world, people only have a theoretical right to sexual and reproductive autonomy. Restrictive laws and policies have made it virtually impossible to access the information, services, and providers that people need to care for their health and well-being. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us, we're also restricted in health information and care that disproportionately and negatively impacts Black, Indigenous, other people of color, the poor, and historically marginalized communities. So as a coalition, we do have some specific priorities that we have for Congress. In the first 100 days, Congress must pass the Equal Access to Abortion Coverage and Health Insurance Act, also known as the EACH Act, which would end the discriminatory Hyde Amendment and related abortion coverage bans. They must pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which would prevent further bans and medically unnecessary restrictions that apply to no similar medical care. Must pass the Real Education for Healthy Youth Act that establishes the first ever funding stream for comprehensive sexuality education in schools. Pass the Youth Access to Sexual Health Services Act, and pass the Global HER Act to permanently repeal the global gag rule. In addition to, we ask that all harmful appropriation riders be eliminated, including the Hyde Amendment, Weldon Amendment, reiterations of the Helms Amendment, the Livingston Amendment, and restrictions of the US contribution to the UN Population Fund. But as well as eliminating any funding, we also want no further funding for abstinence only until marriage or sexual risk avoidance programs. It is well documented that these programs are ineffective and very harmful, and they do no good. Also, we'd like increased funding for critical domestic and global programs, including international family planning and reproductive health, again, the US Population Fund, Title X, the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program, Sexually Transmitted Infection Prevention and Treatment, domestic and global HIV, and maternal health care programs. We have quite a few things after the first 100 days. That's just to get Congress started, but we really see this as an opportunity that we have with Congress. So there are a list of other pieces of legislation that we have for Congress to pass. But in addition, we have laid out our request for the Biden administration. Early on in this administration, they did issue executive action and stated their support for sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. And they have committed to rescinding the domestic and global gag rule, as well as they've taken executive action on Title X. That was an important step, but they've really got to move faster on Title X. Rescinding the Trump rule must happen swiftly so that HHS can compete funds in order to restore services to the 1.5 million people who have gone without Title X funding for over a year due to the Trump rule. We have several other asks that are included in the document, but I really want to emphasize that neither Congress or the Biden-Harris administration can or should be satisfied with just rescinding the harms that have been done. Efforts to restrict access to reproductive health care, including abortion, are constant. And we see it at the federal level, the state level. And at this point, we can no longer count on the courts to protect rights that are afforded to us. And we have an opportunity to actually be progressive and make lasting changes that will improve the long-term health, safety, and security of individuals, but particularly Black, Indigenous, other communities of color, and historically marginalized communities. So we look forward to collaborating with the other on this call, as well as those of you that are listening. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Michelle, and to the Reproductive Health Rights and Justice Work Group for reminding us that we all must be grounded in the belief that all individuals, no matter who they are, how much money they have, or where they come from, have the right to sexual and reproductive autonomy. The next speaker up today is Rose Manatee, who is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Community Change. Rose is representing the Immigration Work Group. The Immigration Memorandum was informed by members of the Progressive Governance Project Immigration Work Group. These organizations are in solidarity and agree on an immigration agenda that centers racial justice, fairness, family unity, economic opportunity, and American prosperity. Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Famala. I wanted to start off by thanking Congressman Chuy Garcia for his comments at the top, centering immigration, and to the Progressive Caucus Action Fund for this briefing. It's been wonderful to see the different issues and movement partners come together on these recommendations. And I'm very proud to represent the Immigration Working Group. And especially the theme of racial justice and analyzing these issues from a racial justice equity lens has come up in many of the earlier recommendations as well. So it's very powerful to see that theme throughout for the Progressive Governance Project. On immigration, members of Congress, especially the Congressional Progressive Caucus, have led the way during the last 4 years on transformative immigration policy, especially with bills that would undo the harm caused by Trump and to affirmatively transform our outdated immigration system. This includes bills like the No Ban Act, Dignity for Detained immigrants, as well as the New Way Forward, just to name a few. And building on this work over the last 4 years, this Congress, we must establish a new immigration agenda that centers the values of racial justice, fairness, family unity, and economic opportunity. At its core, the agenda must be designed to pull us back together, lift our economy, and begin the repair of our nation. And I want to start off by talking about the Roadmap to Freedom resolution. The Congressman referenced this at the top of the briefing. The Roadmap to Freedom was introduced in January by Representatives Jayapal, Chuy, Clark, Garcia, Escobar, and Ocasio-Cortez. And it sets out a North Star vision on the transformation of the immigration system. And it guides us as we work to achieve immediate rollbacks and policy wins this Congress. I will start out by going over our legislative asks. I know everything is drafted in our thorough PDF that's been shared in the chat. So there are legislative demands and there are executive action demands. I'll start with legislative and try and get through the key highlights. So the most important priority that has been centered for decades is citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. And tied to that priority is also acting on legislation that was already passed last Congress by the House. That would be inclusive of undocumented youth, meaning those who have DACA, and a broader population, those who have temporary protected status, which last Congress was HR 6, the Dream and Promise Act, agricultural workers through the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, as well as other workers who've been disproportionately impacted both by the enforcement system as well as the pandemic. It is critical that our efforts on citizenship are fundamental to COVID-19 relief and the nation's economic recovery. I wanted to share as well that there are nearly 5 million undocumented essential workers and families who can be incorporated into the COVID relief and recovery packages that are moving and being proposed. And the HEROES Act is another bill from Congress that really set the bar for immigrant inclusion in these conversations. And to be clear about the path to citizenship, it must be bold and it must be inclusive of the entire undocumented population. And that roadmap to citizenship cannot have categorical exclusions. You know, as we wrote these recommendations, we're now in the first months of the Biden administration, and I want to give a nod to the framework that's been proposed by the Biden administration, which we're anticipating the bill this week. And we have the expectation that that bill will reflect the work of immigrants and advocates to advance citizenship for the 11 million in accordance with our values and without trade-offs. And as I've talked about COVID recovery and economic rebuilding packages, certainly the HEROES Act is a starting place, and I've mentioned citizenship for essential workers, but it's also critical that everyone, regardless of where they are born, has access to quality health coverage. That includes testing, treatment, rehabilitation, and vaccines, regardless of their immigration status, and are also without fear of immigration consequences. Other elements of legislative priorities include re-envisioning the enforcement system, and especially reducing funding for the enforcement arms of DHS, ICE, and CBP. That means demilitarizing enforcement, ending mass immigration detention, and ensuring justice and fairness. So government-funded legal representation for indigent non-citizens who face deportation, an independent immigration court system, ending family separation, and prohibiting the use of racial profiling. These are all key elements to transforming the system writ large. And a new system will center families, communities, and prosperity for all. There are key elements of reform that include eliminating the 3, 10, and permanent bars, the need for backlog reduction for family visas, and eliminating per country caps. The Reuniting Families Act introduced by Judy Chu would accomplish many of those goals. So I will leave it there on ledge and just quickly go through executive actions and also give a nod to the number of executive orders that the Biden administration has already signed that is reaffirming DACA, repealing the Muslim ban, extending what's called deferred enforced departure for Liberians, ensuring an accurate census count. These are only a few, and there are others that we are anticipating and hoping for. I want to talk about the deportation moratorium that was announced on day one. It is tied up in litigation. The moratorium is critical to throwing a wrench in the gears of the immigration enforcement system and stopping the pain of separation in immigrant communities throughout the country. That moratorium, while tangled up in litigation, also has exceptions currently, which is what is resulting in a disproportionate harm to Black immigrants who are being deported, especially from Haiti, Cameroon, and Mauritania. And I just want to say that those deportations must also end. And during the pendency of the moratorium, it is critical to reform the enforcement system. And what we are also looking towards is an affirmative relief program that would be rolled out by the end of the moratoriums. And so that temporary relief like DACA, like TPS, and like a new program called Parole in Place would be in effect while Congress works on permanent protection and citizenship. I will just close by reiterating what both the Congressman and many of my colleagues said, is that we have a truly monumental opportunity right now, this year, after building power over decades, and for the immigrant community, and I know so many different communities that have been targeted over the last 4 years, experiencing some of the harshest attacks we've ever had, that time is of the essence to enact meaningful, equitable, and powerful change. And it will take the White House, Congress, and the movement working together to achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann Rose, and the immigration work group for establishing a new immigration agenda moving forward. I'd like to remind folks that we have 2 more groups left, and so we might go over time a little bit, but just to hang on and join us for the next few speakers who are going to be Pretty amazing. The next two speakers we have up are Julian Brave Noisecat, who is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Data for Progress, and Ben Beachy, who is the Director of the Living Economy Program at the Sierra Club. Julian and Ben are representing the Climate Work Group. The Climate Memorandum was informed by members of the Climate Work Group, and these organizations are in solidarity and agree on creating millions of high-quality jobs by transitioning to a clean energy economy, putting justice at the forefront and responding to the climate urgency and averting climate-related disasters. Julian and Ben, the floor is yours.
Hey, Vamala. Hey, all. My name is Ben Beachy, and I'm with Sierra Club, where I direct our Living Economy program. And Julian and I tag teamed on the climate section. And the climate section of this progressive platform, really like all of the sections that you've heard about so far, starts with the reality that the crises we face are interlocking, and thus our solutions must be as well. That is, our environmental crises are inextricably linked to the crises of racial injustice, public health, and mass unemployment. Any climate plan worth its salt needs to address all of the above. Now, that's something that many folks outside of DC have long known because it's a daily reality. In the Gulf South, for example, the intersection between systemic racism and climate impacts is no more theoretical than the 5 storms that battered Louisiana's Black and Indigenous communities in last year's record-breaking hurricane season. Or in the industrial cities of the Midwest, where racist redlining has led to lower wages and higher air pollution for many Black folks, air pollution that today is increasing the risk of death from COVID-19. So for millions, the links between systemic racism, economic injustice, environmental crisis, and public health have been just as real as the air we breathe. So this climate platform starts with this basic premise. We do not have the luxury of addressing just one of these crises in isolation, and we don't have to. For example, it would not be possible to truly tackle the climate crisis without creating good jobs for the over 10 million workers who currently face unemployment. To meet our climate goals, the platform calls for massive investments to build clean and affordable public transit, upgrade public housing, manufacture clean energy goods, expand wind and solar, replace lead pipes, restore wetlands and forests, support family farmers, and more. There's a recent economic analysis that shows that these investments would essentially end the unemployment crisis by creating enough family-sustaining jobs to cover every person who currently finds themselves out of work. This is also a racial justice plan and a public health plan. Investments in clean energy and clean transportation would reduce the air pollution that is today exacerbating COVID-19 risks in Black and brown communities due to decades of environmental racism. And the platform specifically calls for at least 40% of investments to be in Black, brown, Indigenous, and other frontline communities, not only to cut pollution, but also to create economic opportunities that helped us to close the racial wealth and income gaps. So this isn't just a narrow climate platform that simply counts gigatons of greenhouse gases. It does that, but it's also part of a holistic plan to put millions of people back to work, building a healthier, more just economy that leaves no one behind. Crafting such cross-cutting policy solutions requires a team effort of environmental justice groups, unions, racial justice groups, climate organizations, and others. And over the past couple of years, this broad array of groups has come together to produce several climate policy platforms that informed the agenda that you see in front of you today. Now, having sat at several of these tables, I can tell you that these platform processes took years of trust building, negotiation, and creative thinking among groups that do not always agree. And the result of all that cross-movement collaboration is a menu of policy solutions that you see in front of you that are simultaneously pro-climate, pro-jobs, and pro-justice. And that's not just good policy, it's also good politics. These win-win-win solutions help to unite labor, climate, racial justice, and others in the powerful movement of movements that we need to win policy change. The Biden administration and Congress can help to deliver that policy change in the coming months by working in lockstep with our broad movement. So we look forward to partnering with you all to get that job done. And with that, I'll hand it over to Julian.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you, Vamala. Thank you to the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. And of course, thank you to Representative Chuy Garcia for being on at the top of the call. I was among one of the wonky people who was super excited about the Future of Transportation Caucus. I was actually just reminded of their very important work because my mail lady is out on the street right now doing her deliveries. And one of the exciting things that the Biden administration has committed to is a fully electric federal fleet, which is, I think, a really good and great idea. And pretty soon my mail lady hopefully will be pulling up in a nice little electric mail car. So just really quickly, I'm the Vice President of Policy at Data for Progress. At Data for Progress, we are very into priorities for progress, obviously, but also very into data, which is in our name, and get to run a lot of polls about these issues, the issues that Ben was speaking about, and many of the issues that actually other folks on this call were speaking about. And consistently find in our research, despite claims, including claims that we heard on Fox News just last night about the Green New Deal killing the power grid and getting rid of jobs and driving up energy prices and all sorts of things like that, that not just in progressive enclaves like Oakland, where I'm from, and New York and DC and San Francisco and Seattle, but actually across the country, voters really do support these policies, support the notion that we can get people back to work in good paying, often unionized jobs, that we can clean up air and water in communities that have been denied those basic human rights for generations, and that this is just sensible, that this is the kind of thing that, not just people in California's 13th district, but also in, Kansas's 2nd district can vote for. And, I think that that point is really crucial. I think that very often progressives get painted as being, folks who push the limit and make it hard for Democrats to win elections. But we consistently find that this is a winning package of ideas, and are very heartened, of course, to see President Biden and the Congress moving forward on many of them. So thanks again for your time, and I'll pass it back to Amirah.
Thanks, Ben and Julian, and the Climate Work Group for advocating for the next administration to act quickly and drastically to reduce climate pollution and bolster climate resilience, creating millions of high-quality jobs, building a healthier and more equitable economy along the way. The final speaker we have for today, for today's briefing, is Diana Duarte, the Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement at Madre. Diana is representing the Foreign Policy Work Group. The Foreign Policy Work Group includes the Center for International Policy, Justice is Global, Madre, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Win Without War, Plowshares, the Institute for Policy Studies, Center for Economic Policy Research, and Just Foreign Policy. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing us all together for this important discussion. And also thank you to the other organizations that you mentioned who contributed to these recommendations. Again, my name is Diana Duarte, and I'm with Madre, an international women's human rights organization. On the topic of foreign policy, we recognize that the Biden administration has the opportunity not only to tackle a range of necessary policy changes, but really to reimagine the role that the US plays in the world. We're facing a pandemic that knows no borders. We're reckoning with global racial injustice. We're confronting an existential threat in climate change. And in this moment, we really do have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reinvent foreign policy as rooted in human rights, in mutual respect, collective approaches, and in the common good. And we also have a chance to reinforce the lesson that foreign and domestic policy concerns are actually deeply interconnected, because we all live with a harmful status quo. US foreign policy for too long has relied upon the threat and projection of force on a global scale, purportedly to protect our national interests, but only those as defined by really a tiny segment of corporate and political elites. And these policies have not only failed to keep people safe, but they've destabilized large parts of the world and created endless wars. They've fueled a proliferation of arms and fossil fuels, and they've diverted, resources and political will away from the kind of coordinated global response that we need to urgent crises, including COVID-19. And that's why we generated this list of policy priorities, which again is the work of many different contributors, to offer a path forward to that reoriented foreign policy. And among the many recommendations, which I encourage you all to review in full, we're calling on the administration and Congress to demilitarize, democratize, and bring a peace and justice orientation to US foreign policy. So to demilitarize and move towards diplomacy first approaches, we need to end our reliance on military interventionism to solve conflict. For example, we must sunset the 2001 authorization for use of military force within 240 days and repeal the 2002 AUMF, which have been used repeatedly to justify military operations. We have to tackle the misallocation of resources to the Pentagon, including by cutting that budget by at least 10%. And for instance, we must end all US military participation in the Saudi Emirati-led coalition's war on Yemen. We welcomed the Biden administration's decision to end support for offensive operations in that war, which was truly a testament to the work of many progressive organizers and policymakers over the years. Yet we must still address the broader use of US weapons by Saudi Arabia and UAE, restore humanitarian aid, and push for an inclusive peace process that centers women peace builders, youth, and civil society. On diplomacy, we must prioritize collective approaches to global crises, avoiding the trap of militarized and dangerous so-called great power competition with countries like Russia and China. For instance, the recent announcement of a Pentagon review of China policy is a troubling signal of the direction in which we're headed. So instead, we must advance cooperation on key issues of mutual and global importance, such as pandemic prevention and response, climate change, and global poverty. Other crucial diplomatic priorities include rejoining the Iran nuclear deal with no new conditions and following up on the announcement to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords with plans for a more ambitious US climate response that meets its global obligations. So as I said, another crucial lens that we must bring is a justice-based orientation to policy. So for example, we must advance global economic justice by suspending unilateral sanctions, which have deprived people of access to food, medicine, and essential human needs, including economic sanctions on Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Sudan, Syria, and elsewhere. We must also ensure that COVID-19 emergency relief includes support for global debt relief and also $2 trillion, support for $2 trillion in special drawing rights, which are emergency financial resources from the IMF for countries in the global south to be able to cope with the economic fallout of this pandemic. And I want to take a moment here to especially thank the Congressman Garcia for his leadership on this issue through the recently reintroduced Robust Global Response to the Pandemic Act. And also we must prioritize gender justice. This includes building on the repeal of the global gag rule and further protecting reproductive health by repealing the Helms Amendment, which reduces access to safe abortion worldwide, as was mentioned. And it also means observing the UN call for a global ceasefire and ensuring a leadership role for women and civil society in drafting, implementing, and monitoring ceasefires. And finally, another necessary paradigm shift is that we must democratize US foreign policy and center grassroots voices and expertise. So US diplomacy must devote new resources towards engagement with a really broad set of local stakeholders, including grassroots civil society, community organizers, youth and women leaders who are the engines of change within their societies. And we have to respond to voices calling for investment in reparations to global communities that have been adversely affected by US military actions or presence, by US economic sanctions, and the disparate use of fossil fuels and the effect of climate change. So to sum up, we need a progressive foreign policy that prioritizes cooperation over competition, dignity over dehumanization, equity over white supremacy and patriarchy, and solidarity over exploitation. So thank you again for the chance to share these priorities. And I again invite all to review the full list of recommendations.
Thank you, Diana, and the Foreign Policy Work Group for advocating for investments in diplomacy, multilateralism, development, peace building, and the enforcement of international law to address the greatest challenges that face the United States and all of humanity. This concludes our briefing today. The Progressive Caucus Action Fund would like to thank special guest Congressman Garcia, all of the wonderful speakers today who shared our priorities for progress, and all of the attendees. We appreciate all of you and look forward to many more events ahead. Those who registered for this briefing will receive a follow-up email from us containing the Priorities for Progress website, report, and contact list for the Progressive Governance Project after this briefing. If you have any additional questions or feedback that we didn't get to, please feel free to email me, Vamala, at progressivecaucuscenter.org. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the afternoon.